One of the most underrated parts of a movie is its background. As the characters proceed to skillfully enact the instructions of the plot, the background is the thing that encapsulates it. It is hard to notice within the beauty of a character's performance, but if you pay attention very closely, you will realize that it wouldn't be the same without it. As Roger Deakins, one of the best cinematographers, once said, "I do think observing is important in learning." And I've been trying to do that while watching films, observing the overall qualities of a scene rather than just paying attention to the acting. But as I've said many times before, I do love animation, and in my journey, I've stumbled across some insane backgrounds in animation that fulfills the task of making scenes memorable, where the art is just visually expressive to bring character to an otherwise simplistic frame. But sometimes these artistic backgrounds can transcend the bounds of a frame. It can induce feelings that are beyond just the prettiness of the art. In other words, it can give life to it. There are times when these backgrounds just hit different. I have always felt that backgrounds in animation had a greater impact on the overall story than in live action. It's not that the environment doesn't pose a challenge for the average filmmaker, of course it does. But animation is more like creating stuff from scratch. It's more or less a projection of a collective imagination rather than making use of stuff that already has a material presence. Which means that often artists have to give value to the things that they portray. And this is understandably a difficult skill to even possess, much less take time to perfect. But when you take time to analyze animated backgrounds, it's almost inevitable that you end up starting a conversation about Studio Ghibli. It's almost like background art is synonymous with the world building. The characters in these films are multi-layered and fascinating, the philosophies and themes equally compelling. But for me, the thing that captures my imagination almost every single time is the unmistakable charm of these environments. And notice how I used the word charm instead of beauty. You see, as a non-native speaker of English, I often used words like charm and beauty almost synonymously. It made sense to me that these words had the same impact on a creative sentence. But as I developed a better grasp of the language, I realized that no matter how subtle, there was in fact a difference between them. A piece of artwork could look beautiful, but it doesn't necessarily have to be charming. The same way you could define a person's appearance to be beautiful, but not necessarily charming. And this right here is the essence of a Ghibli background. It's not just about the beauty of a visually striking environment, but rather it's about the character of the art and its interactions with the story itself. Attractive backgrounds are not that difficult to come by. In fact, it is a staple in most of mainstream animation. But wanting a personality for all that's attractive is mostly along the lines of wishful thinking. Just because something looks pretty doesn't mean that it is evocative. But in the world of Ghibli, no matter the director, no matter the style of the story, a background always delivers on this promise. A certain charm about these landscapes that goes beyond the artistic side of beauty. Whether it be the animate or the inanimate, the organic or the inorganic, they all have a specific place in Ghibli's background design. The purpose is what sets them apart from the rest. A tree sitting comfortably in the background is something that will be interacted with at some point. A somewhat aerial view of a city which the protagonist just left behind. What seems like houses at a distance which the protagonist is about to visit. These are not paintings that are wasted on looks, but rather they are a significant part of the storyline. And there are so many of these incredible backgrounds that are planted all over these worlds that I feel obliged to categorize them, to give them the necessary attention they rightfully deserve. It is the fate of modern life that we repeatedly lose touch with nature, the environment, and the planet, but we try to regain it again and again. It's like a circle. In children's hearts and souls, when they are born into the world, nature already exists deep inside of them. So what I want to do in my work is to tap into their souls. It wouldn't be a surprise to anyone that nature is one of the most integral parts of what makes a Ghibli background what it is. The landscapes of Ghibli are resonant with aspects of nature, so much so that an implied version of a Ghibli background looks like this by default. It's almost weird that when you mention the Ghibli aesthetic, this is what people think of, but I guess you can't blame people for such a thing. It is in fact quite instinctive. I have often thought about being in the presence of these backgrounds, to simply exist in such spaces. What would it be like to be part of something that you know is only art, but nevertheless a place that you might desperately long for? The charm of these landscapes keeps calling me back to experience it over and over again. And this is not a mere coincidence. There is a sense of consideration that goes into making one. In the opening scene of Howl's Moving Castle, you can only hear the sound of something mechanical. The landscape is a sheet of blue mist that sweeps across the screen, and then a silhouette appears in the mist. No music, no dialogue, just the sound of the most bizarre structure you've ever seen in fantasy slowly coming towards you. Even if it is only for a couple of seconds, the fog is what sets the mystery, which later gives way to the key plot device of the story, the magical moving castle. And I do love how Miyazaki uses the element of mist to kind of reveal this fleeting mystery. But even in this next shot, the subject is allowed to freely interact with the background. The mist is not something that just exists as an embellishment in the scenery, but it actually interacts with the main subject. As the sunlight pierces through the mist, it naturally disappears, giving us a better view of the subject and the overall location in which the story is about to take place. The background carries information here. It isn't just there to make this shot look attractive, but it is there to give it a personality. The mist rolls over the hills in Princess Mononoke, but being a movie where nature is at war with humans, the mist has a concealing quality to it. The wolves are seen running into the mist to hide themselves from the guns of destruction. And this is not to say that these were deliberate choices that personify something even casual like the movement of the mist. But yet, it simply shows that these backgrounds don't hesitate to interact with the plot. They are there by design. In Porco Rosso, instead of the mist, the landscapes are often occupied by beautiful fluffy clouds that form the perfect backgrounds for planes gliding through. And in a scene of reminiscence, these natural landscapes take a surreal turn. There is in fact a fantastical element to this scene. Clouds don't naturally behave that way, but yet once again, this is the character of this environment coming through. The plane was seemingly floating. It was heavenly white till the edge of the horizon, and the sky was an endless ocean of blue. The overall scene is nothing short of serene. There is this inexplicable feeling that is almost too ethereal to explain. I don't know why I feel a certain way about it, but all I do know is that I couldn't possibly feel those emotions without this choice of background. The landscape is what encapsulates the emotions of this scene. The clouds in Ghibli films aren't just there to fill up the space within a frame, but they are to be interacted with, agents of immersion that only adds to the story. In the other backgrounds, water is what carries nuance and specificity. These landscapes fluctuate based on the type of water that's being painted. In this scene from My Neighbor Totoro, the stream is not only animated to perfection, but it has a life of its own. The water is pristine and transparent, as you would expect from a natural setting such as this. But more than that, as you start observing, you see that there is a bottle at the bottom, plants both underwater and on the banks, dead branches and twigs and leaves flowing through the motion, the sunlight glistening off of its surface, reflecting the foliage that's above it. And to even top it all off, just notice how the fish glow as they sway in the sunlight, which is quite a familiar sight if you have ever gone fishing. But in Ponyo, the water is actually a character. The waves in the ocean have eyes and even a sense of magical awareness. In this world, the water can be a deep blue of harshness or a relaxing tropical paradise. The location of the story would suggest that water is a significant part of the plot. But in doing that, the background artists don't just create this dull and unexciting pool of water, but rather they paint this lively ocean that gurgles, then splashes and rumbles according to the emotion of the shot. And funnily enough, when Miyazaki said, "I do regret something," you know, when the wind blows across water, little ripples form with the gusts, Oga-san and I often talked about wishing we could do that. Now this was simply a keen observation that could not be fulfilled because of time and budgetary restrictions at the time. But fast forward to the later films, they absolutely perfected the subtlety of that craft. In the scene when the forest spirit returns to its corporeal state, the sudden gust of wind blows along the surface of the forest pond, resulting in this. And it is these unimportant details of everyday life that actually gives life to a story. It's not that we all observe nature on a regular basis, but simply in the times we do, we appreciate the swaying of leaves and the many motions of the flow of water. Even the movement of grass is something to admire in a Ghibli background. Speaking of which, the quality of vegetation is not particularly the utmost priority of most animated stories. Sure, if it's important to the plot, they might give it some character, but it's not an absolute necessity. The foliage and grass, the shrubbery and vines, they all might as well be generic and reproducible. It's not like you're gonna notice it, right? Well, in the world of Ghibli, things work a bit differently. Hayao Miyazaki has always been vocal about his distaste for the plastic nature of artificially engineered landscapes and forests. To him, even a natural landscape without a teeming undergrowth just feels like forced nature. And it's not that he finds a beautiful landscape like the redwood forest to be dull and uninteresting, but rather, to him, it's the absence of the familiar, an undergrowth that is teeming with life that he alludes to. In his mind, if you slept on a forest floor, centipedes or pillbugs would come out for sure. Flies, mosquitoes, and horseflies would be buzzing about. And that is why, in this background from Princess Mononoke, not only is there a lush green undergrowth, but there is also life in this undergrowth. When Ashitaka wanders deep into the forest, what he comes across is a true natural habitat, not one that seems artificial. The wild roots of the trees are covered in moss, and just on first impression, this environment feels cold and damp, as if you're walking through an evergreen rainforest. But take a look at all that's happening down here in the undergrowth. The vegetation here is pretty diverse. They don't feel like generic models of nature. There are flowers and mushrooms and shrubs and decomposing leaves and branches. It feels like a slice of a real forest. And aside from these little Kodama spirits, butterflies are seen roaming the environment. The personality of these backgrounds is a bit mysterious, but at the same time, relaxing and easy on the eye. Even the backgrounds containing gardens are beautiful things to behold. In scenes from Arrietty and Kiki's delivery service, the gardens seem to have overgrown their typical size. In these shots, they have grown to be wild and filled with all kinds of flora and fauna. And yet, these are not just shots that give beauty to the landscape, but rather, at some point, they do interact with the key elements of the story. And in almost all of these stories, there is a beautiful moment of reflection, a wide shot of the protagonist standing on perhaps a hill and viewing the landscape from a distance. It's almost like they're taking in the beauty of their environment, a break in the story. And I couldn't believe how common this was across the Ghibli landscapes. It's almost like they don't just want you to admire the beauty of these environments, but actually they want you to absorb it, to feel its presence. And in saying that, you feel like these backgrounds are never overdone. It is filled with the exact amount of substance to process the emotion of a particular shot. Nothing more, nothing less. A shot such as this can easily be overdone by adding unnecessary elements to the background, but it remains rudimentary, at times simple, sometimes complex, perhaps exactly as nature intended. But nature is not the only thing that these backgrounds emphasize. Even an artificial landscape has so much personality to charm you. The quaint cityscapes and the unassuming rural landscapes are often a point of interest in Ghibli worldbuilding. If you are being true to the core, a cityscape is a rather difficult thing to portray in animation. Instead of portraying the subtleties of nature, you'd be spending time conveying the deliberate work of human designs. Artificial places that are sprawling with all kinds of things, with each their own intention. It is a lot to process. But when I gaze upon the cities of Studio Ghibli, I feel like these societies and worlds exist outside the realm of the storyline. There is a feeling that these backgrounds would remain bustling with life even without the existence of the main characters. They were designed with the intention of being a city first and only additionally a location for the story to take place. When Kiki arrives in the city of Koriko, she is amazed by the intricate affairs of a cityscape. As Kiki's broomstick flies over the port, the dock workers are going on about their day-to-day life. There are boats coming in and out of the port, and trucks leaving the docks with cargo. And all of this happens away from the main character. It gives you this feeling of realness, as if this happens here almost every morning. And such things can only add to the character of the background. It tells you a story without actually any dialogue whatsoever. And as Kiki flies into the center of the city, she is shocked by the fast pace of her environment. From her perspective, the background now portrays a wide-angle drawing which is eventful to the extreme. There is traffic going on in all directions, crowds of people gathered around the markets and streets, and everywhere she looked, the world was moving in a hurry. Even without a lot of these shots, the story would have still worked. But that way, perhaps the character of the city would have been lost, overshadowed by the plot. But here, the city is built up to be this organism with individual moving parts. They all have their function, whether or not the protagonist interferes with them. And that is what a background should do. And I didn't know this at the time, but Kuriko was based on a few idyllic cities in Sweden. And it's quite interesting to see a side-by-side comparison of the real place to the fictional one. The narrow streets made of cobblestones, the historical monuments, the colorful houses that have stood the test of time, even the giant clock tower of Gamla, they all appear in the backgrounds as Kiki explores the city. And even for the audience who's never been to such places in real life, they still feel a sense of realism pouring through the artworks. In Porco Rosso, as the protagonist walks along the streets of Milan, the background paints an unmistakable reality. The posters of revolution shredded beyond recognition on walls that have seen better days. And it's easy to realize the condition of the street just through the background art. The cracks and crevices on the buildings, the crumbling concrete and the withering foundations, walls that look patched up. This is not the luxurious side of Milan. It seems neglected and still recovering from the economic side effects of a gruesome war. And such details are the result of thoughtful observation and the understanding of history. After all, albeit a work of fiction, there is a historical context to this story, and therefore, there is a need to portray landscapes that justify a slice of reality. And even in a shot such as this, just look at the lengths they would go to create an immersive experience. This shot could have been a close-up of Sophie buying some potatoes. Only this bit is necessary to convey the story here, but instead, we get a wide shot with loads of background information. There are all kinds of vegetables in these baskets, outlined with beautiful line work. There are people sitting right next to the stall, perhaps enjoying a morning cup of tea. Even the characteristics of the stall would suggest that it is old and worn out. The walls with patchy paintwork would certainly give you that impression. It even provides an extra dimension to the store as it portrays a storeroom filled with sacks of vegetables. I'm pretty sure a lot of these characteristics are extra bits of information that you don't really need to convey the story of this scene. But if done that way, I don't think this interaction would be immersive. I don't think it would have helped me experience the scene. And on the topic of people, there is a sentiment that people are a prominent feature of background art. The concept of extras is perhaps alien to someone like Miyazaki. For him, crowds of people are not a miserable, faceless bunch. They make up society, so draw them properly. And whenever possible, there is an effort made to replicate this very thought process. Whenever a city or village is portrayed with people in them, there is an active approach to animate them. They don't just sit there and fill up the space, they are actively moving about, engaging in affairs that the protagonist need not understand. Just look at all the individual people here. They all seem to be going about their business in the same way Kiki is going about hers. They all have distinct costumes and motivations that are unrelated to Kiki's. It adds a certain weight, a sense of density to the background. This is how societies work, and even in animation, you must actively capture its functioning. But I think one of the more underrated parts of a Ghibli background, more than the natural landscapes and the artificial cityscapes, is in fact the interior designs within the world building. And look, it's not the first thing that will come to your mind when someone brings up the topic of Studio Ghibli, but I swear the charm of these stunningly furnished interiors are easily lost in some of the more conspicuous aspects of Ghibli. In the secret world of Arrietty, Arrietty's room fulfills the role of biophilic design. The background portrays elements of nature embedded into the interior decoration. Since her scale is tiny, even some of these regular-sized leaves are seen to be as big as her. The animators seem to have meticulously worked on the proportionality of these objects. She has her own bed and quite a bit of things in the house that are scaled to fit the size of her people. But at the same time, things that she borrows from the real world are oversized in these backgrounds, giving her room and also the story a proper sense of scale. But one of my favorite indoor environments in the whole of Ghibli world building is portrayed within a scene from Spirited Away. As Chihiro pursues Yubaba for work, she finds herself deep within the mysterious environment of the bathhouse. And without telling you much about the person she's about to meet, you could tell from the environment alone that this person is someone important. Just look at the ornamentation of these backgrounds. The detailing in some of these shots are exquisite. I understand that some of these decorative jars might have some traditional importance, but still, I could not believe that they put this much emphasis on a background that only lasts for a couple of seconds. And even in the shots that follow, the backgrounds are filled with insane details. Textures and ornaments and decorations and paintings and chandeliers and carpets. Never have I seen luxury portrayed so strikingly well in animation. This is how I imagine the interiors of castles look like. But the backgrounds here, no matter how animated they are, they convey the opulence without a fuss. In Howl's Moving Castle, the interiors take up more characteristics. In the faint radiance of the fireplace, Sophie could see an environment that was in disarray. Disorganized cabinets filled with potions and books, completely covered in dust and cobwebs hanging down from the ceiling. But this is just a teaser. The complexity only goes up from here. Howl is seen to be sleeping in his bedroom. As the frame slowly pans to the right, we get a better glimpse of this strange-looking environment. There's a bunch of stuff in the background that on first impression is a bit baffling. What exactly are these things? The number of elements in this one room is quite overwhelming to wrap your head around. The sheer embellishments on these individual objects is stunningly absurd, but all these things add a level of density to the background. But as the scene progresses, we do get an explanation on what they are. The way these objects surround his bed, it makes sense that it is there as a means of protection. But nevertheless, take nothing away from the attention to detail in this scene. This is perhaps one of those environments that will never be replicated, at least not to the same extent. In the tale of Princess Kaguya, the interiors are decorated with a certain elegance that only traditional Japanese art can match. But the environments here are part of a visual aesthetic that is very specific to this movie. The abstract nature of the art style creates imperfect backgrounds, landscapes that are not contained within proper line work. But these expressive backgrounds fits in elegantly with the embellishing qualities of the foreground. Often, the fabrics of these characters blends into the environment quite naturally as it creates this lovely feeling of harmony. And no matter the story, you can't help but feel an emphasis on giving personality to even a boring interior. The careful curation of interior decoration turns these houses into homes. It feels lived in. The backgrounds don't shy away from making you feel that. But be it these natural landscapes or the sprawling cityscapes or even the elaborate interiors, they wouldn't be what they are if not for the careful painting of light. If you ask a background artist on how to create emotions in a painting, they'll all suggest that you comprehend the concept of lighting. Backgrounds are able to tell a story through colors and light. They're quite harmonious in nature, but a lack of understanding of these characteristics could drastically impact the personality of a background. That's when the frame might look a bit flat and leave much to be desired. Alright, so there is this scene in Spirited Away that might not be the most extravagant example of lighting that you'll ever see, but it sort of captures the essence of environmental lighting in the most subtle way possible. As Chihiro walks up the staircase, she takes a moment to observe the environment. She looks away into the distance, and on the side of a cliff, enveloped in the morning sunlight, is the place she's about to visit. And at the time, you don't necessarily know that. This is simply a background that looks picturesque. But fast forward to a couple of shots later, Chihiro and Haku emerge from the garden onto the side of a hill. Chihiro once again takes a moment to take in her environment. And this is not one of those frames that people rave about while talking about Spirited Away. There are many other frames that carry much more significance, but when I was watching it the other day, I couldn't help but pause and observe the charm of this landscape. Just look at how the lighting elevates the emotion of this scene. The textures of the roof panels are sheathed in the morning glow that shows you the imperfections on it. It's patchy and worn out, just how you would expect the roof of a stable looks like. The sunlight even creates these subtle highlights and shadows that gives it another dimension. And like I've said before, the presence of sunlight here is not exactly a requirement. The background would easily work without it. But in doing that, you might lose that sense of familiarity, a feeling that you might have experienced somewhere in your everyday life. And a lot of these backgrounds do accentuate the use of natural light. In almost all of them, sunlight plays a major role in telling a story. And that's how you end up with charming environments such as these, where the atmospheric lighting sets the mood of the scene. In this scene from Howl's Moving Castle, notice how the clouds create these flowing shadows in the background. That subtle element contributes to the feeling of a warm summer day. In the movie When Marnie Was Here, as Anna gazes upon the Marsh house for the first time, just notice how elegantly the sunlight falls upon the mansion. Just like it did for Anna, it gives you this feeling of nostalgia, a longing for a place that you can't quite remember. But perhaps one of my favorite characteristics of sunlight, not just in Ghibli, but even in the real world, is when rays of light seeps through a forest canopy, creating this beautiful filtered effect that almost feels surreal. This dappling of light can even turn a photo into a story. It is that fervent. But much like many other kanji words that can define obscure feelings, there is a word that encapsulates this phenomenon, komorebi. Sunlight leaking through trees. But a literal sense of this word is not quite the point of it. More than a definition, it is a feeling, a beauty that is only felt but not understood. And the reason why I brought it up was to point out how this becomes a recurrence in Ghibli backgrounds. While Marnie and Anna are in the forest picking mushrooms, the rays of light descend through the trees to create these sunspots on the characters. It's a subtle thing to capture, but nonetheless something charmingly natural. This painting from Whisper of the Heart is one of my personal favorites. Without even trying to explain too much, the subtle highlights and shadows created by the diffusing effect of the leaves, it simply leaves an impression on you. You don't really think too much of it, but merely appreciate its beauty in the midst of the story. The sun rays in the wind rises sparkle as they create the sense of komorebi. In the backgrounds of Nausicaa, they evoke a sense of impermanence and mystery. In Princess Mononoke, they symbolize the healing quality of nature. No matter the type of story being told, the lighting in these backgrounds always contributes to it. They don't distract or take away from the main story, but they simply lay the groundwork for the audience to experience the story in a much more comprehensive way. And at the end of the day, even if it is the vision of the director, it's people like Kazuo Oga, one of Ghibli's very best background artists, who is responsible for creating these charming environments. He's the one who painted this frame from Whisper of the Heart, the giant camphor tree from My Neighbor Totoro, the inner forest from Princess Mononoke, and even this infamous house from Spirited Away. And I really wanted to pay credit to some of these unsung heroes who are responsible for so much of what makes Ghibli what it is. His painting techniques are quite similar to Miyazaki's, in the sense they share a curiosity for the world that can only be replicated through keen observation. Just listen to the man talk about painting flowers on trees.
人が見て都合よくかっこよくないじゃないですか。そこら辺の綺麗なアンバランスっていうのかな。
And if you carefully observe some of these backgrounds, is that not what you end up seeing? Perfect imperfections or happy little accidents? But seriously, these backgrounds don't need to be perfect. The characters that you portray, the plot that you develop, none of those things are meant to be perfect. In fact, you want them to have flaws, little imperfections. So why on earth would you expect a difference in the world that these stories take place in? And that's why I love Ghibli backgrounds. They have a sense of liveliness that you can't find in other places. The beauty is not just in the attraction, but it is in the charm of these landscapes. It is not a thing to look at and admire, but rather an emotion that you feel. And that's why they're unique. That's why these backgrounds hits different. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to leave a like and maybe consider subscribing. By the way guys, I started a second channel where I'll be posting live action cinema stuff. Non-animated content is what I meant. So if you're into that, do check it out. The link is in the description. And yeah, that's about it, and I'll see you in the next video.